She might look at us and say, oh, yeah, okay, maybe there's something a little elitist in my rendering of the political sphere, something that's exclusive.
Consider the alternative, yeah.
But consider the alternative. You guys don't even have that. Everybody just works.
You don't even have elitism.
We don't even have an elite sphere.
Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Will. Here with me today is Lillian.
Hi.
Gil.
Hello.
And Owen.
What's good?
So, oh boy, today we have a special treat for us, I suppose. We are reading Hannah Arendt. For today's reading, I asked us to read a section from The Human Condition where Hannah Arendt separates out the public, private, and social sphere. So by way of intro, because Gil kind of asked for this, I'm going to try my best to say what problem Hannah Arendt takes it that she is trying to solve. And the problem, it seems to me, that she's trying to solve is that, Arendt thinks that a well-functioning, let's say, world requires, the spheres of private life, such as the home, of the public, where we would consider politics, and I was holding off on saying the social because it's actually really notoriously unclear what she means by the social, but it should all be in a proper relationship to one another. That, each of these spheres have their own prerequisites and criteria for action. And for her, it seems to me what she worries about is what she thinks of as the public space where we can distinguish ourselves, engage in virtues such as courage and glory, is increasingly being submitted to the dictates of what she calls the social. Now, what she means by the social, the best way to understand it is, at least from what I was getting from both The Human Condition, and I also did a bit of extra reading on Reflections on Little Rock, is pretty much the private sphere running amok. The private sphere in which you engage with your family, which you engage with bonds of sentiment, etc. That, the private sphere wherein it's not about distinction. Instead, it is about conforming to a particular group identity. For her, the rise of the social, or she uses this language almost like, the social is metastasizing. It's growing beyond control. Is the place of conformity. It's a place where instead of engaging with what she thinks, and we'll have to get into why she thinks proper politics is distinction and individuality and feats amongst one's equals, instead it's become about concerns about mob rule, the necessities of life that she thinks, are a necessary condition for politics, but should not be the aim of politics. So it strikes me that Arendt wants to restore order to the world, if I wanted to put it that way. What I find rather puzzling about Arendt is, one, why she allies the social with this notion of mob rule and this problem of life processes that she thinks shouldn't be the aim of politics. Why is that the case? But, another thing that I find puzzling is, on Reflections on Little Rock, as opposed to The Human Condition, she's not as hostile to the social. In fact, her issue with forced integration in the 1950s and 1960s is that this is abrogating the right of the social to choose with whom one associates. And so she goes back and forth between the social is like, this glob that's, metastasizing and almost making impossible the space of politics and appearance. And on the other hand, is something to be preserved because we need to be able to prejudicially choose who we associate with and what we want to follow. And so that's my way of introduction of saying, it seems like crucial to Arendt is having a specific understanding of the political as a place of virtue and individuality. And she wants to conserve what she takes to be this very fragile place. And that means bracketing out and choosing what properly belongs in politics and what should be kept in the shadows of the private sphere or the social sphere. So just to kind of open, and maybe this is a bit too broad, what do we find persuasive about how Hannah Arendt carves up the world between the private, the social, and the public or political. You'll see I constrained you all by saying, what do we find persuasive?
Yeah.
I'm holding the barbarians back from the gate, as it were.
That's right.
So I definitely think that she's right that there has been a kind of progressive atrophying of anything resembling a public sphere. We could debate why that is and why, by and large, the social as the sphere of economic activity and as the sphere of consumption and production has kind of taken over, or in her language, like usurped what ought to be a public sphere that is free of those concerns and is about deliberation, action, political activities, etc. It's, I guess, questionable what has gotten us to that point, or why there has been an atrophying of publics, let's say in the plural. I think I don't want to go immediately to the negative here, but I don't really buy, or at least I'm off put by the idea that it's like modernity, like this kind of epochal explanation as to like why we've seen this atrophying of the public and this rise of the social and the elevation and inflation of like private concerns into like the main concerns of our collective lives. It probably has a lot more to do with actually historically determinate processes, changes in economics and capitalism. Has to do with historical phenomenon like, colonialism and imperialism, the history of patriarchy. Like, it's the epochal explanation for what's going on that I think sometimes that annoys me. And especially, I think, because it becomes so prominent in Agamben, who takes over from Arendt, and a number of other thinkers who speak about history as in these like, these discrete epochs, and then we privilege certain epochs over others. Like, ours kind of sucks, but like the Greek polis ruled. We should go back to doing, I don't know. Does that make sense? There's a bit of a there's a transhistorical vibe about it or an ahistorical vibe about it that bugs me.
It's always the Greeks with these epochal people.
Always.
That's true. So here's like a one way of motivating what she's talking about. What I see in Arendt, and what has made her, I think, very difficult for political theory to place ideologically, is that she has this concurrence of several different critiques of modernity and almost capitalism that are attractive across the political spectrum. So she has a critique that should be very familiar to critical theory. So if you're interested in the Frankfurt School, it's like she has this critique of mass society as a social, like it's making us into these animals that are becoming increasingly isolated and also increasingly the same. And so she has this problem with our inability to distinguish ourselves and to engage in politics. And this is an interesting problem in the post-war era, because that's where you get this mass conformity and the worry about the conservatism of the Western working class and so on. Okay. And then this should resonate with anyone who's read Marcuse or Adorno or whatever. This is the concern of them all. And then she has these other concerns that, the same problem resonates in a different way for Republicans. The idea that a market society, like a market economy, shouldn't become a market society, that the political state, the political realm should be strong enough to control that and to regulate it and so on. And then there's capital C conservative fears of the erosion of the foundation of order. And these are all critiques of modernity that like have different points of emphasis. And I think historically, at least from my impression in political theory, is the reason people feel fascinated with Arendt is that she's not easily put into one of these categories, but she seems to resonate with these concerns. And especially because she has this obsession with politics as the place of plurality, where you're able to engage in this distinct activity of speech and action and able to be recognized by your peers, to distinguish yourself, to cultivate virtue. And this kind of reciprocity and living in plurality is something that's also very attractive to liberals. So that I think is like basically the basis of her appeal. And if I'm being generous, I think she makes some interesting points about that, about what is distinctive about political action and so on. And like, to the more radical crew, it is worth wondering, like, as we said last week with Rancière, like, what is political? The opposite point of view, where everything is political, runs into its limits. And so she becomes, somebody who tries to work that out, I guess.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. And like, so the sort of historical shift that she's describing for one reason or another, and right, we all have our takes about like why this has taken place, is like that there was once a cleaner, at least, distinction between the private and the public. And one of the characteristic features of this thing called modernity is this kind of like explosion of the private outwards into into public life. And this seems to be something like what she means by the quote social, right? She like begins this discussion of the social by being like, hey, actually, that's a really weird way to translate that. Like, even in, who is it? Like Aquinas translates, like, the Homo politicus is like Homo socialis. And it's like, what's this? This new thing called the social didn't exist, actually. And I get it, too. Like, I agree. Like, there does seem to need to be some kind of way of distinguishing between those things that are and are not political. And also to agree with you again, like the kind of resonance with like a Frankfurt style critique, like there is a sense of a concern about something like alienation, right? An alienated condition wherein like we over-identify with this like social mass at the same time that we think that we have discovered this new thing called like our intimacy, like our like individuality, but there's
loneliness.
Something. But it's lonely, right? Yeah, and I liked actually really quite a bit her reading of Rousseau in this chapter is like the person who like diagnoses this condition maybe earliest, and it's true. Like Rousseau is such a cool and contradictory figure. We're gonna have to do an episode on him at some point. But like he's on the one hand like this great thinker of like modern democratic plurality, and also he's this like terrified, lonely individual who like hates it, right? Even in like his social contract, like if your individual will disagrees with the general will, you are wrong. And you get the feeling that he's like, actually, I don't like this at all. But it's not clear like what's outside of that, given the sort of present coordinates of how I want to say society is organized, the world. I should confessional mode. I'm clearly like exactly trapped within the coordinates she's trying to diagnose. So like I have a difficult time with some of these concepts.
Yeah, I agree with both of like Lillian and Gil what you're saying. I think the issue with like specifying politics or the political, like there's the kind of clue, specifying the political the way she does, is that there's something kind of static about it, right? Like she's really into the fact that like polis originally meant something like an encirclement, a wall, and like I guess like the word town and even the Latin urbus, they have these similar etymological connotations with like an enclosure. And she's always talking about the importance of like fencing in these various realms, right? And so she turns the political, the social, the private into these inviolable kind of realms.
My girl loves a good dichotomy. I've never met a political thinker who liked dichotomies as much as her.
Arendt never saw a distinction she couldn't make.
Sometimes
she wasn't going to be
that's because she's a good
to.
Kantian. That's because she's a good Kantian. Kantian loved to, divide things up.
Oh, yeah, I gather.
But I guess so the difference with Rancière though, right, is that like Rancière never tries to delimit, who we talked about last episode, right? He never tries to delimit a sphere ontologically as like this is the sphere where what politics happens, right? He tries to say that politics is a process. It's actually the opposite for him, right? It's a process of like rupturing these enclosures, right? Of changing what counts as political and changing who counts as a valid political actor. Like Arendt is into this notion that politics is done in a kind of elite sphere of equals, and it can't be something that's done on a mass.
Isn't it elitist though?
Hold on. No, I'm gonna just say the big Arendtian mystery, and then I want Will to have that reaction like after this.
Okay.
Because
I'll conserve it.
We'll just put a pin in that.
Put an asterisk on that comment. So I think that the big Arendtian mystery is the way that she justifies this idea of politics as the realm of freedom, as opposed to the social and these other distinctions, on the basis of one more distinction between freedom and necessity. So The private and the social is the realm of necessity, and politics is the realm of freedom. Why does she think this? Because in ancient Greece, she said it was so. So she writes that Aristotle, when he, following Plato, tentatively assumed that at least the historical origin of the polis must be connected with the necessities of life, and only its content or inherent aim, or telos, transcends life in the good life. And then as far as members of the polis are concerned, household life exists for the sake of the good life in the polis. The basis of all of these distinctions is that in ancient Greece, some people labored so that other people could engage in politics. And this isn't something I think that's controversial in like interpretations of ancient philosophy. They were quite clear about this. And it's only with modernity that this assumption changes, that anyone else enters the stage of history or politics. The big Arendtian mystery, as I keep saying, is how this, which is undeniably a conservative with a big C in modernity, but then in ancient society was an aristocratic landholding class of people engaging in politics for their own sake, how that gets translated into political theory of today as the maximally inclusive way of thinking about inclusive politics. Like that is what contemporary political theorists have done. And I think it's worth understanding her appeal and people's like desire and impulse to make that transition happen.
Yeah, I think that is the $1 million question. So I'm going to try to pull back on my "isn't that elitist," because maybe it's a bit too early in the episode to bring Knives Out. But for all y'all who are going to get after me, I have read a lot of Arendt. The Arendt that you might not have liked that I read, like On Violence, Reflections on Little Rock. So here's the thing. I think that she uses this, conception she has of politics. So it's all fine and good if she's just doing this in the human condition, and she's just like, here's a rather formalistic ontological categories of the political, the social, etc. Things run into issues with her when she tries to put that to work. When she tries to engage in her own form of political intervention, her own form of distinctiveness, by marking out where she thinks things are going wrong because there's been a transgression of the political. So my big example is Reflections on Little Rock. She doesn't know what to make of the school, where it turns out it's a mix of actually the private, because children are in the home, the social, because it's it's a place of association, and obviously the government is invested in what's happening in schools. And so here she just gets maximally confused. She doesn't actually understand what the political stakes are, so she assumes that most Black people trying to integrate, they're social climbers. She literally says this. She says, I wouldn't want the state to force me into social climbing. But that's because she can only see that because for her, politics is very distinctive, almost act of gymnastics of showing one's virtuosity in speech and action, while what these other people are doing, that must be simply like grubbing at social status. And
I thought we weren't pulling the knives out yet.
I mean, so if I wanted to bring it back, I wanted to say something like, but her critique of conformism and this distinction she makes between behavior and action, I could see wanting to make something of that. Totally. Not to be too contemporary. Like if Arendt was still alive today, she'd probably look at Twitter and be like, "That's the social right there."
Yeah, I warned you.
Yeah.
Y'all think that's politics, and
y'all think that's
wrong.
politics,
right?
Yeah.
I'm with her. Totally.
Here's giving her flowers. If she had looked at Twitter and been like, hey, why would you all think that's politics? Look, that's just mass reflexive behavior, and y'all are just looking to simp. Then yes. But when she actually has to put these concepts to work, reality doesn't actually, it doesn't make itself available to her. And so she makes these arbitrary cuts, and then it makes you ask, well, what do you actually think politics with actually existing people, not whatever the Greeks were doing in your imagination? What is it? And as Lillian said, it's a mystery. It's a bit of a mystery. And I think also, last thing I will say, it's hard to place her in a political camp because I also just think, and this is my hot take, I think that Arendt is so anti-conformist, she doesn't want to be placed in a particular camp. And so, this is her way of being whatever she is. It's Arendt. So
Yeah,
is
she
she a
even
liberal?
insists really strongly
Yeah.
that she's not a philosopher. She doesn't want to be called a philosopher. She's a political theorist. Yeah.
Sure, okay.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, in the human condition, right, there's that critique that you alluded to of behaviorism and the social sciences in general. And even what seems almost like a kind of nascent critique of like opinion polls and the idea of
Gil
measuring.
love that.
What's that?
Did
Yeah,
love
exactly.
that.
Well,
I was
well,
down.
The other shoe's about to drop though, right? Because she
Okay.
has this critique of like the social sciences being the like intellectual index of the rise of society, and we measure behavioral patterns and we reduce the population down to kind of animal level of inclinations. And so it seems at that point that she's like really taking issue with this way of statistically framing populations and flattening collective life down to just its social dimension in her vocabulary. But then, like in the reflections on Little Rock, she starts talking about how, well, you know, the opinion polls amongst the white people in Virginia say that like 92% of them are against segregation, and they don't really plan on like following these desegregation edicts and laws. So like, I don't know, we don't want mob rule. We better respect what these white folks in Virginia, what they want. You know what I mean? So like, where,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's, again, when she tries to take these like really clean tripartite or binary distinctions and try to work on some actual positions in the world, they end up coming to, I think, some pretty, let's say, controversial or silly conclusions. Like,
Yeah, one way of putting all of this is like a kind of persistent confusion that I have when I try to like think about this stuff is that like I wonder whether or not there is a way to use these categories at all, or whether they're structurally kind of such that you can only use them in this sort of way that is disqualifying of something as political, right? So to explain what I mean, like I could see why someone would look at some kind of act or action or speech or claim and say that actually isn't political, that's just the social, like, you know, you're on Twitter. I almost can't come up with an example of someone doing something like this where you're like, aha, not social, that's actually political, right? Like it never seems to work in the other way. Like, so when I think about this, like,
isn't that like kind of what the argument that the personal is political was meant to do in the first place? It's just now we take that for granted.
yeah, I think so. But like, you know, I like my, like, you know, I'm a fool version of this question is like, all right, so like we're not going to talk about economy, right? Like this is a big deal for her. She's got a lot of gripes with Marx, and like, you know, we of course we all know oikonomia comes from household. We don't want household affairs to be spilling out into the public. That's not politics. I hear this as being essentially like stop talking about like political economy is a phrase she even says like doesn't even make sense, and
It's
we just don't.
yeah.
It's an incoherent, yeah, it's a syntagm that like we should bristle at, but we don't. How bamboozled we are by modernity or whatever.
Bamboozled.
But like, we've been bamboozled. We've been hoodwinked, right? But like, okay, I like just like imagine like two perfect like Arendtian political figures, and they're like they get together in public, and they're like, we're not talking about anything from our private lives, and we're not talking about political economy, and we're not talking about anything social. Like, what do they talk about? What do they talk? What do they say to each other?
it's great words and deeds.
I mean, okay, yeah, like, nice point, Gil. What do they say to each other? But I think the Arendtian answer, I'm going to try to do
How
my
to keep
best,
everyone
Owen,
else
but
out of the conversation.
I wish that was the joke I was about to make, because that's so good.
That is at least 50% of what goes on in the Arendtian public sphere.
How to shut those other people up.
There's a hole in the wall over there. Someone needs to go
my
patch it up. Like, you know.
Okay. Okay, I was going to say, I'm going to try to do my best, Owen, but I don't have anywhere near Owen's stamina. So it seems to me like, it's not even what they say. When Arendt talks about, excellent itself, arete as the Greeks, virtue as the Romans would have called it, had always been assigned to the public realm where one could excel. It seems like actually, politics is about an art for Arendt. How well you are able to, to speak and do and exemplify yourself. Of course, it can't be about how well you're able to simply persuade people, because Arendt has issues with lying. But it's actually, the thing that keeps coming in my head is I'm thinking about Gil's constant joke about Foucault and the gymnasiums. But it is this, though. It is a style. And so it seems like Arendt is, looking forward, she's almost like, where are our masters? And by masters, I mean, we're the cool people who can do politics well. We just got schlubs now and mobs and black people trying to go to schools with white people. And so I think that, there isn't content to what they say to one another, except it's how they do it, how they exemplify themselves before their fellow equals.
This is why I think it's not clear that it's at all going to be possible to use these categories in a non-conservative way, right? Like, because there's no way to look at someone making a claim like this and be like, no, that's your style's bad, hence you're not really doing politics, without it being kind of essentially conservative or elitist, right? Like where are the norms? Where are the implicit norms of the style or the art coming from? Might be one way to put the question. It seems kind of like either bourgeois society or salons, or I don't know.
It's not coming from the working class. I can tell you that.
That seems definitely true.
It's Aristotle, maybe.
I mean, I guess one thing you could say is like, okay, if we look at the history of certain struggles, or if we take the example of like worker struggles, for Arendt, I mean, maybe there's some truth in saying that they're not, like, a union isn't inherently political, let's say, right? In Arendt's language, right? It might be that it's just about kind of like workplace housekeeping, and it's about meeting the necessities. There's a kind of like, basically a balance of power. She says that,
it's like housekeeping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like there's a balance of power in a workplace or in a factory or in a whatever it might be, and it kind of settles into place. And as long as people are meeting their like necessities, there's a balance of power that, everyone knows is in play. And like, wages are decent enough to eat, and you got benefits and stuff. Like, for her, that's all. There's something different. Let's not necessarily go all the way with her and say that nothing about that is political, but I think we can say that there's something different about that. There's something different about that, right? When it becomes administrative, exactly. And like when one can really discern that a kind of public is forming in a workplace in which like what's being discussed and what's being put into motion are principles and actions that outstrip just concerns about like pay and stuff, right? Like, I think, I don't know, I don't know if that example helps to illustrate it, but maybe without going all the way and saying, oh, well, everything to do with unions, or if it's just about your pay or your wages or whatever, that's just kind of like social stuff to keep that, there's nothing political about that. But I think you can still draw some distinctions and say that there's a moment when a union gets politicized, and what happens when that politicizing happens, let's say, is that it takes on some of these features that Arendt describes, in which a public is constituted, in which more is at stake than just the meeting of needs, which, I don't agree that that's not political, but, I'm just trying to be, yeah.
Can groups be political for Arendt? Whenever I think about the things I like about Arendt, I actually really like the stuff where she's just like, what confirms our realities appearing before others, that even, the most shadowy dreams that we have take on reality when, we can exemplify them before others. And of course, this destroys some virtues. Like, she's really against love in politics. She's just like, keep that shit behind closed doors. That's not going to work. And so, I really like also this idea that, that the public is the space in which we can appear and be confirmed in our reality by our other fellows and our other equals. But, I might get flamed on this, but it just seems as if politics for her necessarily, it is what individuals perform before other individuals. And that, groups, and this is something, the reason why I thought about this is, when unions become politicized, I wonder if Arendt would think, perhaps it's politics insofar as there's like a particularly well-spoken, hot and sexy, because when she says appearances, she actually means literal. We learned some reflections on Little Rock when she's just like, black people can't change the color of their skin, and y'all want to skip over that, but that's what we see. I'm like, okay, I don't know why that's so important to you, but got it. Great. Cool. And, they perform this great act of oratory. And, they exemplify their qualities. And so it seems as if, politics is where the individual can make their stamp before other people. But groups can't allow that type of distinctiveness.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, like, I see your point, and I share the concern, but I would think that at least in principle, it seems as though like actually individuals distinguish themselves. Like this action in public is this individuating thing that you do,
Okay.
right? I think it seems that way to me, at least, right? Like this is why it's so important to have this like performative element, this aspect. And if that's the case, I don't see why a group couldn't also distinguish itself
I mean,
in
I
the
guess
same sort of way.
Well, I mean, it depends. I think because the metaphor she gives for the public is the table, right? She says that you need to imagine a political public as a table that both relates and separates.
Yes.
Right? And so, like, I think she might think that group action or group formation doesn't sufficiently separate. It relates really intensely, but it doesn't sufficiently separate to be like, again, I think she's always worried that mobs are going to become the agent, are going to become powerful, right? And so I think her worry with groups would be that, yeah, if the desire is to make groups political, then you're going to end up with like contending mobs and not with individuals trying to distinguish themselves. And maybe one way to help clarify the discussion is to ask, and go back to Lillian's like comments about her wide appeal too, is what kind of individualist is Arendt, or is she an individualist? Because I think that helps to better situate her in a lot of those in a lot of discourses, because I think what prevents her from just being dismissed as a kind of liberal, right? And I don't mean dismissed politically, just kind of like put into that camp in a clean way or something, is that she is very interested in the questions of like commonness and the public and like spaces that are
pluralism, like radical pluralism.
Exactly.
I think that that's the appeal, though. Like, so there's this worry during the Cold War about totalitarianism. And, she writes the book, obviously, The Origins of Totalitarianism, but the conclusions of that book, as far as I can surmise, is a very kind of Cold Warrioring position, which is like whatever is interesting or controversial of her account of like the origins of totalitarianism, what she certainly thinks is that communism and fascism are two sides of the same coin. And so like the interest in plurality that she has, that the starting point for politics is that you can't choose who you live with. You don't choose who you come to share the world with. And therefore you have to engage in these acts of like kind of almost radical, creating commonness out of this radical position of plurality. And her insistence that you can't escape that condition by, the behavior, like, she's against the behavioral sciences and skeptical of economics because she thinks that it tries to supersede this original ontological position of plurality. And from what I can tell is like left liberal political philosophers, I'm thinking of Sheila Ben-Habib, for example, have, really been inspired by this to argue for this kind of like open cosmopolitanism, a way of thinking about the universal foundations of morals and ethics that doesn't slide into particularism, but is fundamentally open and forward-looking in this like world construction that we're all doing together. And this is what is presumably closed off by both fascism and communism. And like, I think that feeling that what makes her attractive to people is that feeling that like she's offering this third way, and people start getting like really excited about this radical openness to the future, about the idea of new foundations in a moment in which like we're all existentially in doubt about having any kind of project, but it's this radically like contingent kind of project. We have to keep refounding. We're not aiming for socialism. We're not trying to close off the nation state. We're just continuously in this process of refounding. And I think this was like radically energizing for like a generation of people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's really great. And it's just like and I also think that there's something what's attractive with Arendt is that, she doesn't offer like a grand narrative. For her, there is something also, I think intrinsically tragic in the political insofar as, it will never be done. it will never, reach some, type of endpoint. That also is what allows natality, one of her favorite concepts, to continually emerge. The reason I made the comment about groups is because one of her famous, lines from The Human Condition is, her claim that, there isn't man, there are men. There is plurality. And we can never forget that. And so maybe there are fragile moments wherein we can act in concert with one another, but that's certainly not the same as fusing into a group and acting, as a group. It is, individuals who, for a moment, are coming together to do something. But the question that, and I get it, we don't get it because we only read one chapter of The Human Condition, but, this whole idea of refounding the public space, like, this all sounds like nice language, but what is that? So what is the refounding of this space that allows us to appear with one another? And this again seems to be where, the ontological and the practical political, it gets at least rather muddy in my head. And so it's like, for what reason are we constantly refounding this space that binds me and separates me from others, except in the name of there should be this space that binds me and separates me from others, because this is freedom. But then when I try to give content to this freedom, it is the appearing before other people. And so you start to lose the grist for the mill, and it can seem as if, there isn't actually if we want to put it this way, a political ideology in Arendt. It is, no, we just need to constantly be creating this space again and again. And I'm just not sure what creating this space means.
It's really good. And this is actually a more general sort of issue that I've found. This is not specific at all to Arendt. This is tons of different thinkers and political philosophers, whenever they try to do political theory or political philosophy that has like this ontological character or support, where you're making ontological claims about X or Y is political or non-political or social or what have you. Because the problem is, if that's true, if it is truly the case that like human beings are ontologically X or Y way, or like being or politics or society are in an ontological way, the way they're being described, then it sort of seems like job done. It's not clear how we could then have problems, right? It's not clear like what the issue could then be. In other words, like in this particular case, as you were just pointing out, Will, it's like, well, we are in fact always separate and related, right? We are in this condition of plurality. And that actually, if ontologically true, I don't see what like bad version of organizing a society could possibly do to change that. Right? Like that's maybe something we're forgetful of in certain moments, but it certainly can't be undone if it's actually a constitutive ontological feature of things, which makes it then difficult to see, what like the action item could be for a political theory when it's got this like ontological character.
I think the action item is, I'm going to just reference Ben Habib again for like people who are more left-leaning that have made use of this, is like a theory of rights, like almost like a right to have rights, like rights that precede other rights. So you can kind of, you can blend it with do a little Kantian sprinkling on top, and then you get
a little Kant in there.
Yeah, sprinkle a little Kant. And I don't mean this to like be pejorative necessarily. I'm just describing it. Like you fuse this with some Kant, and later she gives those lectures on judgment with Kant, so she creates some fodder for this. And then you get this like, not only is it an ontological truth, you get this normative project as well. We're judging beings. We're always these law-making beings. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And I get that, but it just seems like you also have to strip away other things that she says. Like, I think it's in this chapter, not the reflections on Little Rock. She also seems to express a worry that, the political space also should be delimited, and maybe this is how Shayla Ben Habib appropriates Arendt, but should be delimited to those who are like proper citizens. Like she worries about illicit appearances from those who don't properly belong there, and it seems to me that, so I get it, refounding the open space, but it also seems to me Arendt does not think that we are trying to all men, plurality on the planet, should be brought into a single political space. I think she thinks that wouldn't work. That that what would they have in common?
It has to be exclusive. Yeah.
So I'm wondering. So okay, and I don't know Shayla Ben Habib well. She came to give a talk at Northwestern, but I remember asking her a question. Doesn't this all presume the nation state, and what if we need to critique how the nation state organizes the world? And it felt glib to me. She's just like, well, the nation state's what we got, and so unless you have a better idea, and I'm like, okay. Where's the radical openness? And so it just seems to me that like the ontological characteristics that she's given is supposed to be this openness to the new, and yet it's not supposed to be so open. Its borders have to be protected. And I don't mean borders like nation state borders necessarily, but she's very clear that this space is fragile and that you need to keep out elements that don't properly belong there. And it sometimes feels to me that those who are very into Arendt, they want to skip over her saying that. And say, but like the common is great. But she doesn't mean common is universal, though, does she?
No, it's an exclusive common. In order to be a common, it has to. You can't fit everybody at the table, right? If the table gets too big, too, then certain people can't see each other or relate to one another. I think it has to be, and this is why, again, she's so into the etymology of enclosure in all of these words that we have for town and city, is that it has to be exclusive. I don't know. I guess I wonder if part of it is. It's not that she has a vision of a kind of open political sphere in any kind of concrete way, but that she is offering the resources to allow us to understand what it looks like when those spheres are closed off, right? And she's very much like evil is one of the concepts that she returns to over and over in her work, and so it might be that there's like a negative index of what totalitarianism does to us when it closes, when it renders man superfluous, as she describes in Origins of Totalitarianism, right? Or when modern capitalist societies inflate the social and make it the whole of our existence, right? Like it's all just private realm and social, right? It's all our family life, our personal life with friends, our work, our consumption. And that is like what 99.999% of our lives under, it is the usurpation, like the total evacuation of any kind of political sphere or public. And so I wonder if like for her, there's a kind of it's a negative index rather than a kind of positive political program in a certain way, right? Like this is what evil looks like. It looks like this kind of closure, right? It looks like the prevention where everybody, like she might look at us and say, oh yeah, okay, maybe there's something a little elitist in my rendering of the political sphere, something that's
consider the alternative.
But consider the alternative. You guys don't even have that. Everybody just works.
You don't even have elitism.
You don't even have an elite sphere of like public action. All you have is just people working and consuming. You know what I mean? And that's it. And then doing national housekeeping
to their necessity and the products of their own labors.
Y'all just a bundle of behaviors.
Yeah.
Does this feel like freedom to you? Like,
sure does.
Look, fair, Rent, fair.
Yeah.
And the problem is also point. That like I think that's what you said, Owen, the negative index thing, because the problem with like Adam Smith and Marx, and Marx most of all, is that they lean into that, right? They lean into the idea of the socialized man is even worse to her than like she has this great footnote where she's like, Marx made us into socialized men, which is even worse than Adam Smith, who started it all, because he said we were economic men, but now we're socialized men, and that's one further. So the problem with Marx is that he leans too hard into modernity, basically, and what comes out the other side is totalitarianism. So for her, if that's the limit case, and obviously it's fascism, but I think it's interesting that in most of her work, the focus is on communism. I just want to flag that. Like, I know the origins of totalitarianism is preoccupied with the rise of fascism and communism, and maybe even more particularly with fascism. I think in much of her later work, she is really focused on communism. And I think that like that's just important to know, that the negative limit case for her, it's like communism, it's really the specter that haunts this whole book. The whole discourse is a dialogue with Marx. It's like, this is about Marx. The chapter about action is about Marx. The chapter about labor is about Marx. And the problem with Marx is he cannot make these distinctions that she's talking about. and therefore communism as the emancipatory project. And I just want to clarify, because I know fascism is very important to her. That's what the whole thesis about the banality of evil and the Eichmann scandal and everything was about. But I'm saying that that the reason she focuses on Marx and Marxism and communism is because that is the only option that plausibly presents itself as an emancipatory project. No one thinks that fascism is an emancipatory project, so she has to focus on discrediting the left because that is what gives the possible alternative.
Yeah. That's
totally. No, and I think that you're right, that this is in so many ways a dialogue with Marx. And like, we could even frame it as they're departing from a shared set of premises in a sense here, right? Where like, if we think that freedom, like politics is the space of freedom and we like it, it's good, action, expression, political speech, distinguishing oneself, like that's all great. That is, as Arendt herself says, and which is a very Marxist sort of idea, possible only on the basis of the fact that your needs are met in the first place, right? That like this like sphere of necessity stuff has already been taken care of, right? And the Marxist point to make here is like, yeah, that ain't the case for like almost anyone under capitalism, right? And it's as though she reads that and is like, yeah, but isn't it cool that some people still can, and it's like, I guess it is. It's not cool. It's not cool. Yeah. But also like, how about the sphere of necessity? Why have we just kind of presumed that to be taken care of?
I wonder if there's anywhere where she specifically says that the idea that you could have a whole society or a whole body politic like liberated from necessity, like is utopian or something. I wonder if she's ever just come out and said it's like an ontological fact of like social ontology that there has to be a class of people that take care of necessities so that other people can have a space of freedom.
Well, it's almost like they're in the margins, right? Like there's like I think it's a footnote in this, and it's kind of shocking, right? Because this is one of the things that people always say when it's like, we're reading these like ancient Greek political philosophers, and then someone comes along and snarkily is like, well, they were a slave society, right? As though like this is immediately discrediting. But like, given that this is, yeah, no, exactly, and we're not about that stuff here on the pod, as you know, that we think that's a silly move, generally speaking. No, wait, also not the position of the pod.
Got it.
Disavow
the room.
Misread the room. Different. That's what he says to his other philosophy friends.
That's right. And what's nice about politics is we can distinguish ourselves from one another. So I hereby disavow and distinguish myself from Will Paris.
I see you. Hi.
You see me. But like, given that this is her conception of politics is like, appearing in public, and then like the specific model is like the Greek polis, she says it. She's like, yeah, and this was never meant to be for everyone. And there were a slave-owning society. Most of the people weren't allowed to be a part of it. It was like a small minority of like
maybe
male
that's one of the
landowners.
problems with like nostalgia for ancient Greece and trying to like, ground a contemporary political vision in like an ancient Greek slave society. Like, Adorno takes a different tack. I can't remember where he says this, but he's like, yeah, obviously freedom requires being liberated from necessity. And like, because I'm not talking about the ancient Greeks, but I'm talking about 1960, isn't it amazing that we have the technical capacity,
right?
Like actual agricultural
this is the historical materialist insight,
to actually end like our total dependence on meeting our needs all the time, and that's a different tack. Or you can say that like the Greeks were lit because they built a sick wall and kept all the pores out.
I mean, like, what's so funny? You're killing me. What's so funny while reading this? When Arendt writes, "Poverty forces the free man to act like a slave. Private wealth therefore became a condition for admission to public life, not because its owner was engaged in accumulating, but on the contrary, because it assured with reasonable certainty that its owner would not have to engage in providing for himself the means of use and consumption, and was free for public activity." I'm like, you're so close.
Yeah.
You're so close. Based on rent. Based on rent. Go.
And then the next sentence?
Oh no! Did you memorize what the next line was?
No, I just had the same exact
Public
reaction
life
as you.
obviously was possible only after the much more urgent needs of life itself have been taken care of. And she goes on to say, "Yeah, that wasn't for everybody." Oh wow, that's so funny that you went and then I looked. I was like, oh yeah, okay. But like, she's so close. And she's so close. And so it seems to me, if she didn't have to freight it with all this ontology that for some reason, someone argued to me, rather than it being cool, why it has to be rooted in what the Greeks did. I get it. It's really cool to write things in Greek and not transliterate it because, that shows how awesome you are. But like, give me the argument though, because if you had done away with this, then you could actually have an argument where everyone should be able to appear because their needs have been met, and then we can see what politics arises once people are free to engage with one another and bring something new into the world. But by framing this ontological, it's because Owen, the problem is, sure, meeting everyone's needs, but as soon as you make that a political project in order to make that the aim of doing that, then she has an issue. Well, that's
it can't be communism.
Well, no.
Because I guess we've decided it can't be communism.
That's
she
means
doesn't
without
have
an
a
end.
positive content. Yeah. She certainly has a positive content for what she doesn't want. What she does want, gymnastics in the polis.
Well, this is exactly like the difference between having a materialist and a non-materialist like approach to history, right? Like when Marx reads Aristotle's political works in Capital One, he's like, look how much this dude could figure out. Pretty cool. And also, he couldn't figure out certain things precisely because he lived in a society whose mode of production was essentially slave owning. So he was constrained in what he was able to think and conceive, right? And like now, 200 years of the development of the modes of production and the forces of production into capitalism, we could just do away with the necessity stuff. We could end it. We could abolish it. Instead of making it an ontologically unsurpassable fact. I don't know.
Well, another symptom of the ontological kind of closing off or fencing off of these different spheres is like, I just don't think it's very historically accurate that like this is what emancipatory movements that are built around meeting human needs actually look like. Like she makes it sound like when there's a movement that is organized around like meeting basic needs or about like guaranteeing the material conditions of life or something, that it's just people going, I'm hungry, like give me the food. I want a bigger, I want a bigger share.
Cookie Monster.
Yeah, exactly.
Cookie Monster in politics.
Exactly. And I'm like,
what?
Well, okay. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find any movement over the last like 150 years where material stakes were in play, where there wasn't all of this other stuff that she considers to be politics like going on, right? Like the elements of like appearing, of like great words, of incredible speeches, like deeds that aren't just exhausted in their accomplishment kind of thing, ways of immortalizing ourselves, right? She's really into like political immortality, like ways of immortalizing ourselves and creating a public through that immortalization and all of that. Like I just like the building of public infrastructure and spaces and for political and public activity. Like I just don't know what she doesn't really talk about any emancipatory movements in most of her work, and she talks about the French Revolution, but only to kind of trash it in favor of the American Revolution. Yeah, I mean, I just wonder who she was talking to. Or like on the Reflections of Little Rock, like why didn't she just get on the subway, go talk to James Baldwin, and like you might and like how
funny story. She does engage with James Baldwin. She hated the fire next time. She quote was terrified by the invocation of. I wrote a whole paper on this. Terrified by the invocation of love at the end of the fire next time, because wherever there's love, there is destruction of all that is political. And Baldwin apparently responded with, he's just like, I just don't think Arendt understood very well what I was doing.
That's a good.
Like, so
good
she
response.
tries to engage.
Okay,
she tries, but it's
yeah.
just like, and look, I don't want to I do want to dunk on Arendt, but I just want to say that it's not about Arendt the person. I don't know what was in her heart and all of that. That's in that shadow realm. I only know how she appeared in political space. And it seems to me that all of these categories
Get her.
really mutilated her political vision, especially when it comes to the United States, where she didn't understand. She was new and she had no clue on how deep this was. She's just like, in Europe, we don't do this. This is weird. Anyway, here are my thoughts.
Listen, this is not a sophisticated point, but if you read The Fire Next Time and you get to the end of it where he's talking about love and your reaction is terror, something has gone wrong. I don't know what else to say than that.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful.
You went down the wrong path at some point.
You made a turn somewhere.
Yeah, she's super anti-love appearing in any kind of political valence whatsoever. But
fair enough. I hate PDA too. Okay?
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
I'm not a fan.
My private stuff's private still, by the way.
Yeah.
You don't think it is? Can we talk just for a minute about the French Revolution thing, though? Because I know that you all have thoughts about the way that she understands the French Revolution, and I kind of want to hear your takes.
I mean, I was just looking through the On Revolution book, before we were recording today.
Nice.
And, it's just quickly going to the spots. I remember her discussing the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which she privileges over the French Revolution, precisely because one of the reasons, she likes republics, so she's a Republican of sorts. But also, I think when we're trying to reach for examples of what political action looks like for her, the writing of the drafting of the Constitution and the kind of political dynamic at stake amongst the founding fathers of the United States, for her is pretty emblematic of what politics looks like. And their Constitution, she shares with Kant a nice fondness for founding constitutions and thinking about constitutions. But when she talks about the French Revolution, it's that these massive herds of poor who for centuries have existed in obscurity were bringing their social,
all of a sudden make their appearance.
Yeah, they make their appearance on the political stage, and it just wrecks everything. That's not who's supposed to be acting in the political sphere. And she says it's not coincidental that's why you get terror, right? You get violence because the sphere of necessity has entered into the public sphere where it's not supposed to be. And so, it's in some ways it's a pretty classically conservative view of the French Revolution, but the privileging of the American Revolution is special.
I think.
Say what you mean.
So here's the interesting thing. I'll just tell you my experience in reading Arendt, because I somebody who has been received and aimed to be uncategorizable. I'm never going to convince anybody of my own reading. But first of all, I just despise. I just loathe people who think they can't be put into categories.
Love a good category.
Yeah, I love a good category.
Big fan.
Yeah, unsurprisingly.
Put me in a box.
Yeah, I
feel comfortable in the box.
Yeah, I like the box. I'm such a troll about Marxism because you put in my case, because you put yourself in categories because it's a response to other things. And there's something cowardly to me about hiding your own views. I really can't stand it. And I think that a lot gets going for people with Arendt because she creates this opportunity to sort of hide your views. And to her own credit, she does offer them, and they are wanting, as Will has described it in detail. So I'm not saying that she's always cowardly. I'm just saying that there is something about the uptick of her, where at the end of ideologies and I am like Arendt, impossible to categorize. And
I think that's true of her.
I just don't have that much. I just don't have any. To be blunt, I don't have much sympathy for this. But in my reading of her, when I started reading Arendt in grad school, I remember I did find her very compelling, and I was in a different place intellectually, and I did like that about her at first. And I found it very mysterious and provocative. And, the conversation, is she Republican? Is she a liberal? Is she, of the left? Is she a critical theorist? Is she this? Is she that? Just kind of. And then I had this, for the first time, I had this experience that you can only have when you realize that somebody you're talking to has a political perspective that you just haven't really seen in real life before. There's this moment in which people kind of puncture the ideological sphere and they're not recognizable anymore because they're saying something that actually is recognizable, but within a different ideological configuration. And when I realized that, I was like, holy shit, she's actually a capital C conservative. Because if your whole orientation is against the French Revolution, to me, that's the archetype of what it means to be a conservative in the modern era. But that has to be qualified because she's clearly a conservative that's made her peace with is approving of the liberal state and so on. But she's not the only conservative to do that. Most conservatives today accept that, the liberal state in some form, in whatever capacity, and some more tenuously than others. But Edmund Burke came to terms with liberalism. He was just like, we have to do it piecemeal and gradually and everything. So it's possible to accept that and have her whole thing about plurality, but if your primary orientation is like the French Revolution is where things went wrong, to me that's just, and then your whole thing is about the Greeks and all the stuff we've discussed, I think it's a conservative view at its base.
Well, no, but I think that links up with the observation you made, Lillian, which I think is right, that lurking in the background is really communism. right? And despite the work directly on fascism that she's done, that when she describes some of these concerns in the human condition about like aspects of modernity, it always feels to me like she thinks they're way worse in like bureaucratized societies as she understands it in like under communism, right? Like that's the paradigmatic example of what the takeover of the social looks like, of what even the obliteration of the private sphere, which he says happens under, in totalitarianism as well. Like you have the total destruction of where the dividing lines between the different realms of human existence should be. And that it's also happening in like 1950s America and in capitalist Europe, but to a lesser extent. And we should be on guard against becoming, against basically falling into the very worst, right? The total scrambling of like, the proper ontologically determined way that these spheres should be carved up. So, I mean, I think that, I think the anti-communism is a central motor of the thought. I just want to say this before we end. Like there are things about Arendt. I was also into Arendt for a while, and I wrote my master's on Arendt and her reading of Kant, my master's thesis, and Kant's aesthetics especially. And like in a kind of naive, almost way, where like pre-critical way, where I suspend my theoretical and political orientations, I genuinely think that she's really right and grasps something really right about humans and about some of the needs that we have that outstrip our just like material needs, the things that distinguish us from animal life. And it's the way that it all gets parsed, reified, that drives me nuts, right? So, maybe and on that positive note. But
That's a shame because I was actually going to just do one last dunk, but maybe we should call it on a positive note. Those of you who are interested in my one last dunk, though, I don't understand. I guess I'm doing it.
You guys are going for it.
We need one last dunk.
For those who take Arendt very seriously, and I kind of said this earlier, but I think it's important to just really put a pin in this. Who take her seriously on her notion of the political as appearing before others, and then whenever she's dealing with American politics, especially anything having to do with Black political movements, she reads them as havoc and chaos. Look at on violence, where she has a footnote. Now they want to have Swahili in college. This is a complete degradation of the political project, though I don't know how many people were actually, demanding Swahili, but I want to know how they deal with the fact that she makes appearance so important. So many. That's all that they were talking about in the 1970s, I guess. Appearance is so important to her, and it's not metaphysical. It is literal. She says it herself that you can't just skip over color. It's inalterable for Negroes, etc. How do they explain why anytime there is a Black political movement that she's commenting on, she reads as distinctly non-political, illicit, and as fundamentally disorder?
Same for the women's movement. Like that's what she thinks about the feminist movement as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
and obviously the workers. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of all
social
of them,
and social climate.
It's all of them, and so it's like all the, it starts to look like for someone for whom appearance is so important, she has this very constrained idea of who ought to appear, what appearance looks political and what appearance doesn't, and so you can blame that on her foibles, you can blame that on where nobody's perfect, but she makes appearance so central, and I'm wondering how do you explain that? And this is the angle I come at Arendt with what I do in philosophy of race. And I've not read anyone who has actually been able to salvage that beyond saying, like, I guess she didn't get what was going on. Oops. But that doesn't get around the issue that appearance is so important.
But that doesn't rescue them because she says the same. Like I said, I think you're right about color and her approach to Black movements. But if you want to say she didn't know what was going on, do you think she didn't understand feminism? Like, especially of the European variety of her generation? Like, you think she didn't get what was at stake for women in the household? I mean, she's maybe not as much as others, but, there's a way in which, like, how deep does the not getting it go? And, I went to the... Yeah, I went to the
that's a nice
exhibit.
Diplomatic way of putting it.
Yeah, and like I went to the Hannah Arendt exhibit at the German Historical Museum here in Berlin. They had a special exhibit. And one of the things, they had one of her interviews, and she was just talking about how, she's not hostile to feminism, but she just says that's not her thing. She says, there's just some things for women that I think are unfeminine or undecent, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's just what I think. So, appearances, it comes out in different ways, and I totally agree with you about color, but I just wanted to raise that's like it's reflected across different movements.
No, I just think if there is one way maybe to save, just to refer back to our episode last week, is that if there is one way to save like the appearance thing, it's something like Rancière's account of the distribution of the sensible, right? That obviously appearing is a really important and central dimension of politics, but the strictures on who appears what way and how people appear as being capable or incapable of certain things, or as deserving of certain kinds of treatment versus other kinds of treatment. I mean, the distribution, the conditions of the appearance, the historical conditions of that appearing, like, have to be accounted for. You can't just have this is the problem with I keep going back to this, but with ontologizing politics and creating spheres. Like, there's the sphere of appearance. Okay, I mean, what are its dynamics? I mean, how is it altered? How is it changed? Like, who changes the terms, and how can the terms with which people appear change? Like, I don't know. You see what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And this is like what I was saying before about how, like, I'm not sure that there's a way, once we draw these distinctions the way that we've done here with Arendt, between like the political on the one hand, and let's add the qualifier, and the merely social on the other hand, right? That, like, I don't know if you're going to be able to use these categories in a way that's other than conservative, right? Basically in this disqualifying gesture. So it's not surprising to me that once these are the sorts of conceptual apparatuses that we've kind of set up, that when we see, like, how did she actually read workers' struggles, women's movement, the Black movement in America, it's like all merely social, like non-political. But, like, that's what the conceptual apparatus allows you to say. I'm not sure it lets you say anything positive.
And confused and chaotic, right? There's that great moment in the Reflections on Little Rock. It's actually her little preface to it where she describes, why she wrote it. And she says, I know that some people are saying that, interracial marriage isn't the most important thing for the Black community. But listen, what you need to understand is that oppressed people often don't understand themselves, like, what's best for them. Okay. And so, we're like, we're going to have to.
It just moves on. Just like.
We can't. Yeah, exactly. It just moves on. We can't trust their account of what, of what they think they need or what's best for them.
Yeah. It's just me in my apartment. You can trust me there.
Yeah.
I get it.
Well, on that note, that does it for us today. I hope y'all still with us. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are William Craven, Jenny Logan, Paco Brito, Michael Mellett, Oliver Mann, Jonathan Fisher, David Gerhardt, Ben Dunn, B, Mark Muchain, Improved, Anthony Morgan, Patrick, Piyush Pushkar, Pat Malone, David Moser, B, KM, Eric Walter, Nicholas O'Connor. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. And please follow us on Twitter at LeftOfPhil. And don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.